This week on Inside Scoop, rediscovering the concept of a balanced budget, Democrats move leftward in abundance, the possibility of peace in the Middle East, and bad things are happening in blue cities. Welcome to Inside Scoop, where we talk about all the news that's fit to print in the Washington Examiner magazine. I'm Jim Antle, your host. And in this issue, we talk about balanced budget amendments. When's the last time there was a balanced budget in the United States? The federal government hasn't balanced its budget since 2001, ran 3 consecutive budget surpluses during the last years of the Clinton administration, and before that, there hadn't been a balanced budget since 1969. Now, the current federal budget deficit is $1.8 trillion, down $41 billion from last year, but a few billion dollars is not a really big difference when we're talking about trillion-dollar deficits. It took the United States until 1987, the first 200 years of the country, to have a trillion-dollar federal budget. Now, the federal budget deficit is usually much larger than that. Why? Well, some of this happened during the Great Recession, during the COVID-19 pandemic, but we no longer have the pandemic, we're no longer in a major war, and we're not in a recession. The economy is still growing. So it's unusual for us to be having deficits of this size. And the fact that the deficit is now a chronic thing and not an intermittent thing in response to unusual national conditions, it's just a permanent way that both parties like to govern, has become a major problem. We are approaching a $38 trillion national debt. Interest payments on the debt are starting to eclipse all of the money that we spend on our national defense, which is the primary constitutional responsibility of the government. Republicans blame out-of-control entitlement spending as the long-term driver of the debt. Democrats naturally blame the Reagan, Bush, and Trump tax cuts, saying that they don't bring in enough revenue to cover all of the spending that they'd like to have. But the reality is that this is a bipartisan problem, and there seems to be a bipartisan disinterest in doing much about it. Now, there are efforts in Congress to reintroduce the balanced budget amendment. There are various versions of that amendment and about 5 resolutions to do that in Congress right now. But since the 1990s, which is the last time there was really a major push to ratify such an amendment, because Republicans generally supported it, the last 2 Republican presidents at that time, Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush, were big supporters. But it's really sort of stalled since then. Donald Trump is not a very big deficit hawk. He said that he wants to leave Social Security and Medicare spending alone. Certainly, we've run pretty big budget deficits during both of his presidencies. Barack Obama, we ran very large deficits, and it's really during this time period where trillion-dollar deficits have become the norm. Can members of Congress make a change to the Constitution to dramatically alter this ocean of red ink that we're drowning in? Or is this pretty much the new normal? And until the debt sinks the economy, which has yet to really happen, this is just what we're going to have to deal with as politicians like high spending and low taxes, and they don't want to have anybody pay for it. Is there anything we can do about it? If you're watching us on social media, comment down below. And this week, I'm joined by Washington Examiner senior writer David Harsanyi. Welcome, David.
Thanks for having me.
So, David, you've written in the magazine issue this week about the Middle East peace process, and we always talk about how remote peace in the Middle East is. It often seems to be, but it's not totally unrealistic to think that something at least better than what we've seen in recent years is possible. Is that correct?
I mean, I think so. I think there's this myth, or people believe this myth, that there's a war between the Arabs and the Israelis. I mean, that war is long over. Israel is at peace with most Sunni nations, if not, explicitly with a peace agreement. There's clearly no war going on between, let's say, Saudi Arabia and Israel and so forth.
Right.
It's it's between the Palestinians, mostly in Gaza and Israel. I think now that there's going to be a buffer zone around Gaza, now that many nations have signed on to Trump's agreement, which is 20 points long, and the first point is that Hamas must de-radicalize.
Sure.
There's a chance that that can happen. It's not going to be easy. I don't think Hamas is going to voluntarily give up its weapons as easily as we think. But if you have them in this sort of hermetically sealed bubble there, you could stop them from getting Iranian arms. You could stop them from launching, hundreds of missiles at civilian, towns and so on. I think there's a chance in the long run that you're going to have some peace. I mean, it's definitely not a sure thing, but I think that now there's a chance. Yeah.
So one of the interesting things is that the way in which President Trump arrived at this ceasefire is pretty much the opposite of what everybody in the ceasefire now crowd and a lot of our allies recommended that he do.
Yeah. I mean, I think going back to his first term, when he struck the Abraham Accords, I think for the first time in decades, there was an American president who circumvented the Palestinian problem. That's not to say that he didn't invite them into the mix, that he doesn't want to fix that problem. But for many decades, every agreement or many agreements were undermined by trying to fix this problem that is clearly very difficult for numerous reasons to fix. And the Palestinians from my perspective, have just simply been unable to agree to a deal. When Yasser Arafat was presented with his own state, I think he had to say no because the radical elements within Palestinian society don't want it. I don't know if that's still the case, but Donald Trump circumvented that problem to make other deals. And I think he did the same thing here in a way. Hamas is not, they're at the negotiating table. Israel wanted back their hostages, but they're not in charge of their future. I mean, to some extent they are because they have an army, but
Right.
in other ways, the plan for Gaza is not really in their hands, and it shouldn't be. One of the points in Trump's peace proposal is that they not just de-arm, but get out of politics as a group, Hamas. So we'll see. But I think that's what's that's what's different here.
There's also an element of this where peace was made possible by Israeli victories. That this was allowed to sort of unfold in a way that Israel scored some major wins on the battlefield.
For sure. A lot of Israel has lost on the PR front here in the United States and elsewhere. There's no doubt about that. But when you talk about this war, it wasn't really a war against Hamas as much as it was a war against Iran and its proxies, which surrounded Israel. So when you think about it in that way, you think about what happened to Hezbollah, which was soundly, defeated, weakened, which led to the Assad regime falling. And we'll see how that turns out again. There are a million ethnicities and clans and tribal tensions in the area, so you don't know how that's going to work out. They embarrassed Iran militarily, and with our help, they set back their nuclear program. They hurt the Houthis, and they decimated Hamas in a pretty significant way as well. So that, by any standard, I think is an impressive military victory. Israel is now the superior military force in that region, and I think that means something to them, despite PR losses. I think, in fact, it's much more important to them. They are much safer now than before. And I think because they are safer, there's a better chance for peace as well. Depends what Iran wants to do. They want to rearm. They want to go back to the same situation. Israel will have to act again. But there's a chance, they have a chance not to do that.
Thank you, David.
Thank you for having me.
If you're watching us on YouTube, you can click here to read David's full story in our digital magazine. And I'm joined this week by Jay Caruso. Jay, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Jim. Appreciate it.
So Jay, you've written a piece in this issue of the magazine looking at the direction of the Democratic Party. And we hear all of these prominent columnists and policy wonks talking about the abundance agenda and how the Democrats can become more pro-growth and things of that nature. But that doesn't really seem to be the direction the party is headed in, is it?
Unfortunately, no. I haven't read the book, but I've read enough about it, understand the abundance agenda, tearing down regulations, and to have more growth, not in the private sector, mind you, but to allow the government to more freely build and grow. Unfortunately, you have a situation where the Democratic Party, it's been a slow creep, but the progressive wing of the Democratic Party is slowly but surely kind of concentrating more power within the party and kind of leading away from something like that, like the abundance agenda. They much rather have
Good
what
evening,
you kind
everyone,
of
and
see
welcome to
with
this New York City.
Mamdani in New York City, who's probably going to be the mayor. I mean, this is a guy who says we're going to have government-run grocery stores, we're going to have universal child care. Now, I mean, he's winning in New York. It's not like it's a bright red town, but they have elected Republicans in the past, and everyone thought maybe after the de Blasio debacle that this wouldn't happen again. And now they're going even further to the left, which is then going to, regardless of the fact that it's just a city mayoral race, it's going to kind of embolden progressives to say that this is something that we could do on a much larger scale.
Right, you have to figure, given that the Democratic Party looks a little directionless, they might be leaderless at the moment because they're shut out of power in Washington, D.C., that if Zohran Mamdani wins, as he's expected to, that other Democrats are going to look to him, number one, as a leader in his own right, but number two, as maybe an example they can follow in other races.
Oh, absolutely. And don't get me wrong, Donnie's run a terrific campaign. He's a very affable guy. He doesn't look like some wild-eyed conspiracy theorist.
Great message
And
discipline.
he's what he says at times even sounds reasonable if you're just the average person. And so there's a good possibility that his model will be something that they'll go for instead of the usual Bernie Sanders yelling about millionaires and billionaires. Beyond that, um, but it's a question of whether or not they can bring that outside of like the deepest blue cities in the United States.
How much of this is a reaction to the populist shift of the Republican Party?
Well, that's the amazing thing. You have Republicans over there ever since the era of Donald Trump, a lot of times co-opting the economic policies of what was typically Democratic turf, tariffs, Trump taking positions in private companies, Josh Hawley and other Republicans pushing for things like credit card interest rate caps. These are all kinds of things Republicans never would have dreamed of doing just 15 years ago, but now it's completely different. And Democrats think, okay, well, we've lost some of that working class voter edge to the Republicans, and we have to do something about that. We have to kind of bring those voters back if we can.
And yet you don't see very many examples of the populists in both parties working very closely together. I mean, certainly they co-sponsor some legislation together sometimes, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of affection between these two factions.
No. No, and there's still a giant chasm between both of the parties. There may be some crossover with economic populism, but when it comes to other issues, particularly, the cultural issues, that's where I think Democrats are kind of falling into a trap by kind of taking on and sticking with those cultural issues that just are not that popular in the United States.
Those 80-20 issues that people often talk about.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the whole thing. It's like what I said in the article was, all the issues about trans rights. I mean, it's a gimme for Democrats to sit there. And it's not like they have to abandon the position entirely, but the whole idea of going all in the way they do, that is one of those issues where the majority of Americans, including the majority of Democrats, are not on their side. And that's where they can have some trouble. And it doesn't necessarily mean that those voters who might otherwise vote for them are going to run and vote for a Republican, but they might just sit there and say, I like what he has to say about the economy, but this other stuff, I'm just going to sit this one out. And that could prove to be, very detrimental to the Democratic Party, especially as we're coming up on the midterms.
Thank you, Jay. If you're watching us on YouTube, you can read Jay's full story by clicking here on our digital magazine. The Democratic Party has enjoyed a monopoly on political power in major urban centers for generations, with Republicans having little ability to stop them from implementing their best policies. Our Amy DeLaura lays out what happened in 5 cities where Democrats had unchecked political power.
No hide. That's right. Good job, boys.
Democrat-run cities have long been symbols of dysfunction, plagued by crime, failing schools, homelessness, and crumbling infrastructure. Smaller urban areas, including Baltimore, Denver, Minneapolis, and Portland, are mirrored in the same struggles, but often with fewer resources to fight back. Despite spending more than $18,000 per student, far more than the national average, Baltimore City Public Schools routinely ranks among the worst in the nation. Only 16% of Baltimore's 8th graders were proficient in reading, and only 8% in math. Baltimore has long had a corruption problem that permeates every city agency. In 2010, then Mayor Sheila Dixon was forced to resign after she was convicted of embezzlement from funds intended for needy families. In 2019, then Mayor Catherine Pugh resigned after she pleaded guilty to tax evasion and conspiracy charges in connection with funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars for healthcare nonprofit groups to her own benefit. A bombshell 2022 report found half a dozen Baltimore City public school administrators and principals had fraudulently changed the grades of over 12,000 students to boost the system's graduation rate. And in 2024, former state's attorney for Baltimore, Marilyn Moby, was convicted on 2 counts of perjury and 1 count of making a false statement on a mortgage application. Maryland legislators recently wrote, quote, "The level of fraud in Baltimore City schools is like a cancer. It has metastasized, almost completely unchecked for decades." Baltimore's current mayor, Brandon Scott, has so far managed to avoid any corruption scandals, and while he has invested hundreds of millions of dollars into the school system, the city's test scores have not improved and still rank among the lowest in the nation. Baltimore has not had a Republican mayor since 1967. Colorado's homeless population has grown 90% since 2020, and the surge is being driven by the state's largest metro area, Denver. Home to the city's Gothic theater and music scene, Broadway has become plagued by homeless tents and encampments in recent years, a problem that stems directly from the city's approach to dealing with homeless people. It doesn't help that the state legalized marijuana in 2014. Studies show that states where marijuana has been legalized have higher rates of substance abuse than those where marijuana is legal. And close to a third of Denver's homeless population reports having a substance abuse problem. Another 36% report having mental health condition. Cities have basically 2 choices when addressing homeless populations: housing first or intervention. Denver, of course, has chosen the more liberal housing first approach. And the numbers speak for themselves. It isn't working. Denver's current mayor, Mike Johnson, declared a state of homelessness emergency in 2023. Denver has had only Democratic mayors since 1963. Minneapolis was the epicenter of violence and rioting after George Floyd's death, and crime has surged since. While most of the country saw large declines, especially in homicide in 2024, the city's murder rate climbed again. The percentage of murders solved by police was over 90% in the 1960s. Nationally, that number has fallen below 50%, but in Minneapolis, it has cratered to 38%. Violent criminals know they can kill and not be caught, and they're responding accordingly. As in many cities under Democratic control, Minneapolis mayors, prosecutors, and judges softened on crime after the deaths of Michael Brown in Ferguson and Trayvon Martin in Florida. The city hired fewer officers, prosecutors declined many drug and nonviolent cases, and even violent offenders received sentences far more lenient than the national average. Minneapolis hasn't had an elected Republican mayor since 1961. Portland, Oregon has long been a mecca for left-wing politicians. Subsequent Democratic mayors have spent generously on the city's Clean Energy Fund and Preschool for All, neither of which solved climate change or reduced income inequality in the city. But they did cut millions in spending for road maintenance, and now Portland drivers are paying the price. According to a recent audit by the Portland Bureau of Transportation, 64% of all streets are in poor or very poor condition. A separate report found the city faces $4.4 billion backlog in street maintenance alone. Portland has not had a Republican mayor since 1973. When leaders prioritize ideology over accountability and basic governance, ordinary citizens are left to shoulder the burden. The Democratic Party has had complete control over most urban cities for almost 50 years. Is it time for the party to be judged by the outcomes it's produced? Back to you, Jim.
Thank you, Amy. You can read that story and all the articles we talked about in today's episode in our Washington Examiner magazine. This has been your Inside Scoop. I'm Jim Antle, your host. We'll catch you next time.